The trip my daughter and I had eagerly awaited was finally here, and yet you, who had no part in its planning, are clearly unwelcome. My father-in-law began lecturing the moment my husband, Ethan, stepped away from the table. We were supposed to be enjoying a relaxing vacation that I had spent months arranging, but with his attitude, I was tempted to head home. I'm Emily, a married woman who manages a successful career while working from home. I spend much of my time at our house, handling the bulk of our domestic and financial responsibilities. Ethan, on the other hand, is always trying to appear more successful than he really is, spending recklessly on things we don't need, but conveniently avoiding any of our actual expenses. During our early days of dating, I had no idea he was so irresponsible, but once we moved in together, it became painfully obvious. Ethan's mother, Olivia, is his biggest cheerleader. She never fails to sing his praises. While I knew she loved her son as most mothers do, I wasn't prepared for how dismissive and cold she'd be towards me. Olivia is convinced that Ethan is flawless, and she has no problem letting me know that I don't measure up to her standards. She's especially critical of my job, constantly implying that working from home isn't real work. Even though Ethan knows I work hard, he never steps in to correct his mother when she belittles me in front of him. Instead, he just lets it slide, telling me that it's better if we work it out ourselves. The one time I asked him to step up and defend me, he responded by throwing divorce papers at me, a gesture that stunned me. It made me reconsider everything about our marriage, but I knew a divorce would be just as exhausting as this relationship. Despite his mother's constant criticism, I've stayed because of the practical benefits. We live far from his family and only see them occasionally, so I figured I could manage. However, things took a sharp turn when Ethan announced an out-of-the-blue trip overseas. He was eager to impress his co-workers who had just returned from fancy vacations abroad and wanted us to join the trend. Despite his lack of preparation, he didn't even have a passport. He insisted we go. To make matters worse, Ethan casually mentioned that his mother would be coming along for the trip. I nearly laughed out loud at the absurdity. Managing two clueless travelers, neither of whom had any idea how complicated international travel could be, felt like an impossible task. But Ethan, oblivious as ever, just brushed it off, expecting me to handle all the arrangements. After days of stressful planning, the trip finally began. At the airport, both Ethan and Olivia were utterly useless, wandering around aimlessly while I managed every single detail. By the time we boarded the plane, I was exhausted, and to top it off, they both acted as though I was the one enjoying some luxurious escape, while they were mere passengers in my grand plan. Upon arriving at our destination, things only got worse. Ethan suddenly came down with a mysterious illness, disappearing to the bathroom and leaving me with all of our luggage. As if that wasn't enough, Olivia immediately began berating me, claiming the trip was supposed to be a special mother-son bonding experience and accusing me of ruining it. Her words were the final straw. I calmly handed her Ethan's suitcase, picked up my own bag, and left without a second thought. I had already planned for this moment, secretly booking myself a flight home in case things went south. As I strolled away from the chaos, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. I arrived back in the States, spent a few peaceful days with my parents, and decided it was time for a fresh start. While Ethan and Olivia scrambled to survive without me, losing their passports and money along the way, I filed for divorce. It was surprisingly easy, considering Ethan had already done half the work by throwing the papers at me months earlier. In the end, Ethan's reckless behavior caught up with him. He's now drowning in debt, struggling to support both himself and his mother, while she continues her lavish spending on beauty treatments. Meanwhile, I've moved on, free from the burden of their drama, and enjoying my newfound independence. Ethan might have thought he had the upper hand, but in the end, it was me who walked away with the last laugh. After returning to the States and settling into my new life, it felt as though a massive weight had lifted off my shoulders. My new apartment was peaceful, a sanctuary from the chaos that had defined my marriage. I spent the first few days decorating, buying furniture I actually liked, and relishing in the quiet. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly anxious, waiting for the next disaster to drop. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, expecting it to be one of my friends or perhaps my parents checking in. Instead, it was an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Emily, it's Olivia," came the voice on the other end. I froze, unsure of how to respond. The last thing I wanted was to deal with her again, especially after everything that had happened. "Why are you calling me?" I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "I don't know who else to turn to," she said, her tone unusually soft. "Frank is a mess. He's drowning in debt. The apartment is falling apart, and I don't know what to do anymore. I never thought it would come to this." Part of me wanted to hang up right there. After all, she had made my life a living hell for years. But another part of me, the part that had always been the fixer, couldn't help but feel a small twinge of pity. I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "I know I've been harsh on you, Emily," she said quietly, "but I didn't realize how much I depended on you until you were gone." There it was, the closest thing to an apology I'd probably ever get from Olivia. But it was too late. I wasn't going to step back into that mess, not after I had fought so hard to free myself from it. "You treated me like an outsider from day one, Olivia," I said, my voice firm. "I did everything I could to make your son's life easier, but it was never enough. I'm done being the one who fixes everything. You and Frank are on your own now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I imagined Olivia sitting in her rundown apartment, finally realizing that she was no longer in control of her perfectly curated world. "I see," she whispered. I thought maybe we could try again. Start fresh." I sighed, the temptation of a clean slate flickering in my mind. But I had learned my lesson. Some bridges were meant to stay burned. "I'm sorry, Olivia, but that's not possible. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same." Before she could say anything else, I ended the call. It felt like closing a chapter of a book, one I had been stuck in for far too long. In the days that followed, I heard through the grapevine that Frank had lost his job. Without my steady income to support him, he had spiraled further into debt. His lavish spending habits, once hidden behind credit cards and loans, had finally caught up with him. Meanwhile, Olivia had resorted to selling off her expensive beauty treatments and jewelry to keep them afloat. As for me, I was thriving. My work had taken off in ways I never expected, and I had even started traveling again, this time on my own terms. No more last-minute, chaotic trips with ungrateful passengers. Instead, I was exploring new cities, meeting interesting people, and reconnecting with the parts of myself I had lost during my marriage. One day, while sipping coffee in a quaint cafe in Paris, I received an email from a lawyer. It was from Frank's attorney, asking if I would be willing to meet for a final discussion about the divorce settlement. I couldn't help but laugh. The settlement had been finalized months ago. There was nothing left to discuss. I responded politely, but firmly, letting them know that I had no further interest in anything related to Frank. Whatever mess he had made for himself was his to clean up. I was no longer his safety net, and I was certainly no longer his wife. As I closed my laptop and took another sip of my coffee, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I felt free, truly free. No more drama, no more expectations, no more walking on eggshells. Just me, living my life the way I had always wanted. And that was more than enough. A few months passed, and my life grew even more peaceful. I'd gotten back into my groove with work, taking on new clients and expanding my business. My solo travels had become a way of life, exploring new cultures, immersing myself in languages, and meeting people who appreciated me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. One day, while I was visiting a local market in Lisbon, I received a text from an old friend who had been in touch sporadically throughout my divorce. "Did you hear about Frank?" she wrote. My heart skipped a beat, though I didn't know why. I hadn't thought about Frank in weeks, months, even. Still, curiosity got the better of me. No, what happened? A few minutes passed before she replied. He's been arrested. Arrested? I stared at my phone in disbelief. It felt surreal, like something out of a bad soap opera. Frank had always been reckless, but I never thought he'd actually crossed the line into criminal behavior. My mind raced with possibilities. Debt, fraud, something to do with his mother's spending habits? After a moment of hesitation, I decided to call my friend. She answered on the second ring. "It's a whole mess, Emily," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and concern. Apparently, he got involved with some shady business deals after he lost his job. He was trying to pay off his debts and keep his lifestyle going, but it all backfired. "What kind of deals?" I asked, still trying to process what I was hearing. From what I've heard, it had something to do with illegal investments. A Ponzi scheme or something like that. He got in way over his head. They're saying he could be facing serious jail time. I sat down on a nearby bench. The sun warmed on my face as the reality of the situation sunk in. Frank, who had always cared so much about appearances and impressing people, had dug himself into such a deep hole that he might not be able to climb out. And his mother? I asked, though I wasn't sure why I cared. She's been trying to defend him, of course. But even she's run out of resources. Word is, she's been living in a small one-bedroom apartment, barely making ends meet. Most of her friends have distanced themselves. A strange sense of closure washed over me. This was the final chapter of Frank and Olivia's downfall. They had built their lives on lies, manipulation, and superficiality, and now everything had crumbled. I didn't feel sorry for them. If anything, I felt relieved. Relieved that I had escaped before their world imploded. Relieved that I wasn't the one left picking up the pieces. "Are you okay, Emily?" my friend asked after a long silence. "Yeah," I said, exhaling deeply. "I'm more than okay. I'm finally free from all of it." We chatted for a bit longer, but my heart wasn't in it. After hanging up, I wandered through the market, taking in the sights and sounds around me. The vibrant colors, the aroma of fresh bread, the distant hum of Portuguese chatter. It all felt so real, so alive. This was a life I had always wanted. Free from drama, free from people who drained me. Later that night, as I lay in my hotel room, I reflected on how far I had come. Frank's arrest felt like the final nail in the coffin of my past life. It was over, truly over. There would be no more calls from Olivia, no more manipulative schemes, no more exhausting attempts to salvage a marriage that had never been built on solid ground. I thought back to the Emily who had stayed silent while her husband threw divorce papers at her, who had organized elaborate trips only to be berated and ignored. That Emily was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more self-assured, someone who had learned that her worth wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that my future was finally mine to shape. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. I decided to extend my stay in Lisbon and explore the surrounding towns. I no longer felt the need to rush back to the States. To what? My life was here, wherever I wanted it to be. I spent the following weeks traveling through Portugal and Spain, indulging in the freedom that came with having no ties, no obligations. I picked up new clients along the way, further expanding my business, and even reconnected with some old friends I hadn't seen in years. Eventually, as summer began to wane, I found myself back in Montreal, where it had all started, where I had walked away from that ill-fated trip with Frank and Olivia. This time, though, it was different. I wasn't running from anything. I was simply visiting, enjoying the city for its beauty and vibrancy. One evening, while walking through the old cobblestone streets, I received a notification. It was from a local news outlet reporting on Frank's trial. Out of curiosity, I clicked on the link. The article was brief but detailed. Frank had been sentenced to several years in prison for fraud. His mother, too, had been implicated for her role in hiding assets. As I read the final lines of the article, I couldn't help but smile. Not out of malice, but out of sheer relief. I had truly escaped the storm, and now, more than ever, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. With the city lights twinkling around me, I felt lighter than I had in years. The future was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where it would lead.